Welcome to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. My name is Daniel Murphy, and I am Assistant Editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly. If you are new to these podcasts, please visit the Florida Historical Quarterly on Facebook, where you can now access abstracts of each article in the current issue of the journal. Today's podcast features interviews with the guest editors of the winter 2012 edition of the journal, which is a special issue titled Florida, the Mediated State. This issue includes an article by Allison Meek titled Murders and Pastels in Miami, the Role of Miami Vice in Bringing Back Tourists to Miami. An article titled Is South Florida the New Southern California? Carl Hyacин's Dystopian Paradise by David M. Parker. A conceptual essay by Charlie Haley titled Florida Porch Reverie. An article by Leslie Kent Poole titled In Marjorie's Wake, A Film Voyage into Florida's Nature Consciousness. And another conceptual essay titled Miami Stories by Jeff Rice. Accompanying these works is an introduction by the issue's guest editors, Dr. Julian Chambliss and Dr. Denise K. Cummings. Dr. Chambliss is an associate professor of history at Rollins College, where he teaches about urban history and culture in the United States. He is the coordinator of the Africa and African American Studies program at Rollins and is a board member of the Society for American City and Regional Planning History. Denise Cummings is associate professor of critical media and cultural studies at Rollins, where she teaches about film history, theory, and criticism. She has curated numerous programs on indigenous films from the U.S., Canada, and Latin America, and annually serves on selection committees for the Florida Film Festival. In this podcast, you will listen to my interview with Dr. Chambliss and Dr. Cummings about the significance of Florida as a mediated state. Today we're speaking with the guest editors of the winter 2012 Florida Historical Quarterly special issue titled Florida, the Mediated State. Julian Chambliss, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
My name is Julian Chambliss. I'm an associate professor of history at Rollins College and the coordinator for African and African American Studies. My research focuses on 19th and 20th century urban development and culture.
Denise Cummings, could you please introduce yourself?
I'm Denise Cummings. I'm an associate professor critical media and cultural studies at Rollins College, direct the film studies program and Australian studies program here. And my areas of teaching fall under film studies and also Native American film and culture.
Great. Thanks for talking to me today. The title of the FHQ special issue you edited is Florida, the Mediated State. What is the mediated state?
I think our goal for this project was to explore how Florida is portrayed in popular media since 1945, and the idea that Florida's evolution and depiction really says a lot about the broader American experience. So Florida as a mediated state means that it's literally being processed and reprocessed for the public, and in doing so, it says a lot about the American experience after the war.
Okay, Denise, what first interested you in the idea of a mediated state?
Conversations with Julie and I started early on in our work at Rollins when we recognized that we were in a community that had a movie theater that was no longer movie theaters. The Colony, it's right here on Park Avenue, and it's a pottery barn today. And our discussion sort of evolved about thinking of the community of Winter Park, particularly the commercial district, and how it had changed over the years. And looking at the theater itself as a part of the bygone past and a lens through which we could talk about that past. And our conversations led to a museum exhibition about the Colony Theater, but it was really about talking about the changes that had come to downtown Winter Park and the changes that had really come to the state of Florida since mid-century. So it enabled us to talk about race relations, talk about economic development, talk about urban development. So it was a way in. And that initial project definitely helped us formulate greater thoughts about Florida in the popular mind. How is Florida perceived outside of Florida? How is it even perceived within Florida? And this generated a lot of discussion and a lot of scholarship that has eventually led to the publication of FHQ this month.
In the special issue, the works written by Charlie Haley and Jeff Rice are not standard historical analysis of Florida's history. How would you characterize these works, and why are they important to our understanding of Florida history and the mediated state?
Our goal with this was to really bring a kind of interdisciplinary focus to Florida, because Florida is so complicated as a space, and not just simply as a geographic space, but also as a kind of conceptual space, because Americans think of Florida tied to some very deep post-1945 concepts of affluence, of community, of suburbanization, of paradise. And those are really long-standing themes in terms of Florida. So Florida is never defined just simply by its physical or its real history. It's also defined by its imagined experience that people have with the place. And so when we first started talking about this project, we really started talking about, well, there's this gap between the sort of hard history that we are all familiar with and this imagined history. And we wanted to create a space to sort of bridge those things, to create greater understanding between the both. So the thought pieces, those pieces by Charlie Haley and Jeff Rice, do that. They give you a place where you can bridge a gap that's created by the history that you know versus the history that you feel, the stories that you feel. And this is a long-standing idea. I think that's really important to understand why people maybe misconceive Florida, or why something on television is more real to people about Florida than the actual history of the place.
I had known the work of Charlie Haley and Jeff Rice for a while and thought of them because they're both rather interesting scholars in their fields. Charlie Haley is a practicing architect and a theorist, and Jeff Rice is a practicing digital media scholar and theorist. And their approaches to scholarship have always stood out as being really unique. And by inviting them, they were able to actually take the task and run with it and almost do it in the first time around. Produce this work that sort of intervenes, if you will, in the larger historical discourse. And we were really excited about that.
Okay. Well, Julian, you mentioned, just kind of following up, you had mentioned the idea of the difference between kind of I don't know if you said real history, but you said history of how you feel.
Right.
Okay. Can you talk about that a little bit more? What does that mean, history of what you feel?
I mean, I think one of the things I was really concerned with in terms of thinking about this project is that there is the Florida that's very much grounded in a traditional historical narrative. And that Florida is very well known. Search for the Fountain of Youth. It's the transformation, the coming of Disney. It's Miami's transformation. It's geographic. It's suburbanization. It's post-World War II and vacations and all these things that are very well known. But at the same time, Florida is also a place where people recognize that there are different narratives that they don't necessarily have a personal experience with, but they've heard about. They heard about the story of Florida. Like there's something happened with Cubans in Miami, and like they know that there are Cubans in Miami, but they don't speak Spanish. And there's a sort of North Florida that is Jacksonville, that's like South Georgia, but like they don't necessarily understand. And then Orlando is always like Disney, but that's not really what it is. I mean, there's an agricultural history there that people have a vague understanding of, but they don't deeply understand it. So what they know is not really the history, but the story of the history that someone has told them. And then they have this sort of mediated, they've seen it on TV, they've heard it on a story, they've seen Miami Vice, they've seen Disney movies, they know about the theme parks, they've seen Celebration, and all those things they know, but they don't know exactly how they're connected to Florida. And so they have a feeling about Florida, but they don't have a strong sense of the history of Florida. So like there's always, you experience this in class all the time, students hear a story about Florida. I never knew that. I've been here my whole life. And you can hear that probably about many stories of many states, but Florida is always that huge shock associated with it. I never heard that. I've been here my whole life, and they have this strong sense of shock, whereas I think in other parts of the country, they just don't have the same sense of like isolation from the past that they do in Florida. And so these imaginary stories about Florida have almost as much weight as the real story of Florida. And so you have to negotiate between the two. And nationally, this is very important when people talk about Florida. People know at some sort of intrinsic level, Florida is representative of a lot of changes that are taking place in the country. And sometimes that's a good thing. But a lot of times when people talk about that, it's a horrible thing. It's not a good thing. And that affects the way people talk about Florida or sort of engage with the state too. And so it's those kinds of questions that's really sort of framing it.
I think Jeff Rice's piece enacts something about the feeling of Florida, although he is coming from a perspective of knowing the history. So he's not just writing it from not knowing the history, but he's using writing to sort of get at, how do I feel about Miami? What do I feel about Miami? And how can one write that? And when you do that exercise, and he often sees it as a very inventive sort of practice, bringing together these moments and these snippets from pop culture and sort of pulling them all together and finding the connections. And when you do that, he suggests there's something new that comes out of that otherwise we wouldn't maybe have thought about, we wouldn't have felt. And I think his piece is really reflective of that sense of how does one feel about Florida? I come from out of state. I'm not from Florida. And I think I always, growing up, had a feeling about Florida. I didn't know what it was. I just knew things about it, but I didn't really know a lot. And now that I live here, you find that there's this whole really interesting history that somehow gets obfuscated. I don't know, it gets covered up by this imagined place. And we really wanted to get at that. We wanted to start opening that conversation.
Well, along those lines then, is Florida unique in terms of this mediated state or this felt history? I assume you could apply this everywhere, but is Florida unique in any way, or is it pretty much the norm?
I do think that Florida is unique. I think that there are few states in the union that can match Florida in terms of its mediated state. I mean, I think California, which we kind of alluded to in the intro, has a similar kind of feel, but that feel is a little bit more diluted in a way. I mean, it's not as specific. There are moments where things about California sort of like waif across the border. You could be talking about Nevada, you might be talking about California. You could be talking about Oregon, you might be talking about California. When people talk about Florida, they're talking about Florida. You know, when they're talking about New York, they're talking about New York, but again, the mental space of New York overpowers. Like New York City overpowers the entire state of New York. Florida is like Florida. It's a huge state, and it's a huge mental space because it's such a big state. When people talk about New York, they're talking about New York City. California, like I said, those are the only two. I mean, Texas has a similar kind of thing, but again, it's very difficult for them to articulate, I think, the same kind of mental image. Strangely enough, I think people say Texas, and they know that it's big, but they don't have the same sort of like cultural markers associated with it, in my mind. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm sure we'll get angry letters from people from Texas.
I think Florida is unique because of its tourism. I think that really marks it as a popular destination because it has a kind of secular mecca in Disney. When people make a trip, kind of a rite of passage with their families, they go to Disney. So already we have, yes, you can go to Disneyland, and I do think California is really closely aligned in this sense, but Disney World and all the theme parks draw people. Now, that's only one part of Florida, I know, but I think that contributes to this imaginary. And where do people visit the imaginary spaces of Disney and find some kind of fulfillment out of that? We know it's a lot of people really enjoy that sort of, trip. And I think coming to the state and then leaving, one can probably get a sense of another kind of imaginary space. When do they really get the real? And so I think Florida is unique, and I wouldn't want to say that every other state in the union isn't unique. I think they are, but I think Florida holds a unique sort of place for Americans across the country.
And Florida always has paradise as a touchstone, and other places don't. I mean, you can say a lot about California, but no one ever thinks about it. Paradise as a thematic core. I mean, there are lots of decadence maybe in Hollywood, sure, but the idea that it's paradise. which is really important because, of course, with Paradise, you often graft on your greatest desire, and the tourism thing sort of reinforces that. Oh, you come here as a kid, you're going to the greatest place on earth, where like they create this incredible experience, and Disney is quite successful at that. But you never actually see the real Florida. Like people always say, "Oh, you live in Orlando, you live right next door to Disney." I'm like, well, really, Disney's kind of far from where I actually live. And if you came to Disney, you really actually see any place that I'm actually going to on any given day. So it's very different because of that. And I think that matters a lot in trying to understand Florida.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for speaking with me, and thank you for your contributions to the Florida Historical Quarterly and Florida history in general.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining our international audience for this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. The Florida Historical Quarterly is the peer-reviewed scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The Society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in the state of Florida. The Society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the journal are in the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. I hope you have enjoyed the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast and that you will consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. Go to www.myfloridahistory.org for membership details. Please join us at this year's annual meeting of the Florida Historical Society, which will be held at the Hyatt Regency Hotel in Tampa, Florida, from May 24th to May 26th, 2012. The theme of this year's meeting is Tides of Change, Diverse Florida Communities and Their Development. More information on the meeting can be found at www.myfloridahistory.org/annual meeting. Finally, we invite researchers to access back issues of the Florida Historical Quarterly on JSTOR. Thank you for listening to the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast.